Donald Trump just looked Nancy Pelosi in the eye and dismantled 37 years of political armor with a single whisper about ice cream and crumbs. Welcome back to the broadcast, everyone. I want to talk to you tonight, not just as your host, not just as a broadcaster, but as someone who has spent his life in the political arena. I have stood on those debate stages. I have looked into the lenses of those cameras. I know the exact temperature of a television studio, and I know what it feels like when the oxygen is suddenly pulled from the room. What we all witnessed tonight on CNN was not just a debate. It was not just another political sparring match over fiscal transparency and government accountability. It was the surgical deconstruction of a political legacy, broadcast live from the Washington Bureau, and it happened in a way that absolutely nobody saw coming. Let me paint the picture for you because you have to understand the mechanics of what just occurred. Trump had been loud all night. We expect that. He is a man whose presence is like weather. He fills a room the way a storm fills a valley, and the studio had gotten used to the sound of him. In politics and in television, you get used to that kind of volume the way you get used to the sound of traffic if you live near a highway. It just becomes the background hum of the evening. But then the volume dropped. He didn't shout. He leaned in and he spoke quietly. He spoke almost gently. It was the tone of voice you use when you are talking to someone you have completely stopped being angry at, because anger, my friends, requires hope. Anger implies you still think the other person might change. He had moved completely past it. He looked across the table and said, "You called their money crumbs, Nancy, from your freezer." Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi did not answer him. I watched her hands. Her hand moved to the stack of note pages sitting right beside her water glass, and she began to fold the top page. She folded it once. She folded it twice. It was the exact same motion, the precise muscle memory that 25 million people watched on national television 4 years ago. You all remember that night. It was the night she folded a different set of pages before she ripped them in half behind a sitting president's back on the floor of the United States Congress. Every camera in that CNN studio caught the echo of that moment. The director in the control room caught it. And I guarantee you, in living rooms all across this country, the people who remembered that night caught it too. She folded that piece of paper a third time. Then she set it down flat on the table carefully, using both hands. It was the way a person sets down something they know deep in their bones they will never, ever pick up again. She did not rip it. There was absolutely nothing left to rip. I want to take you back 90 minutes earlier to how this entire seismic event started. The CNN anchor opened the broadcast the way we always open these things in the news business. It was brisk. It was professional. He gave a sentence about the format, a sentence about the topic, and a sentence reminding the audience at home that this was a CNN special event. The stated topic was government accountability and fiscal transparency. The participants were the President of the United States and the woman who had spent more time arguing with him about the future of this country than most married couples spend arguing about the thermostat. The anchor turned to the speaker first. She had requested to open the debate, and Trump had agreed. As a politician, I can tell you exactly why Trump agreed. He learned a very long time ago that the first person to speak in a room is rarely the person the room actually remembers. Pelosi began. She said, "Thank you." She was wearing her signature Navy suit. She had on the pearl strand she always wears. And she wore that practiced, impenetrable smile that she has perfected in front of 10,000 cameras over 37 years in Congress. She thanked CNN for hosting. She said she believed in accountability, and then she delivered her opening line. She said, "I've served the people of the great city of San Francisco for 37 years, and I want to talk tonight about what fiscal responsibility actually looks like when you," and that is exactly where the trap snapped shut. 37 years, Trump interjected. The anchor tried to intervene. He turned and said, "Mr. President, we agreed to 2-minute opening statements, and the speaker has the floor." But Pelosi, ever the veteran, said, I know, Trump just held up one hand. It was an easy gesture, like a man waving off a waiter at a restaurant. He said, "Go ahead, Nancy. 37 years. Tell them." As someone who reads political momentum for a living, I can tell you the damage was already done. Everyone in that room felt it, except perhaps the people who desperately did not want to feel it. That phrase, 37 years, was now hanging in the cold studio air right above Nancy Pelosi's head, like a heavy price tag she could not reach up and pull off. Whatever she was going to say next was going to be filtered through the weight of those nearly 4 decades of power she tried to adjust. You have to give her credit. She is brilliant at adjusting. When you survive in Washington that long, you learn how to lose a beat and pick up the next one without the audience ever noticing. But this audience was not a compliant press gallery. And the man sitting across from her was not a polite Senate colleague who would just pretend he hadn't interrupted her. She continued, saying fiscal responsibility means investing in people. She listed the Affordable Care Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, the infrastructure bill. She called them results, not rhetoric. CHIPS Act, Trump said, nodding slowly. We'll come back to that. If you have ever played a high-stakes card game, if you have ever seen a master player set a card face down on the table without even looking at it, you know exactly what he did. He marked the card. He didn't play it yet. He just placed it where she could see it, and then he moved on. And for the rest of the night, Pelosi had to sit there knowing that card was waiting for her. The anchor turned to Trump for his opening statement. Trump didn't give a traditional statement. He didn't address the moderator. He bypassed his microphone, looked right past the studio audience, stared directly into the lens of the camera, and spoke straight to the people sitting at home. In 2018, he said, we cut taxes. And companies all over this country gave bonuses to their workers, $1,000, some of them $2,000, $3,000, real money. Money that went to real people who did real work. Then he turned his head and looked at Pelosi. Nancy, do you remember what you called that money? Pelosi's smile held firm. She gave the Washington answer. She said the corporate tax breaks were disproportionate, that 83% of the benefits went to the top 1%, and the bonuses were small compared to what corporations received. Crumbs, Trump said. You called it crumbs, $1,000. You stood in front of cameras and you called $1,000 crumbs. He turned right back to the television audience. I want to ask anyone watching at home right now, is $1,000 crumbs to you? Pelosi leaned forward. She said, this is exactly the kind of oversimplification. Trump stopped. He didn't stop because he was caught off guard. He stopped the way a man stops when he looks down and finds a $100 bill on the sidewalk. He repeated her words slowly, tasting it, rolling it over his tongue. Oversimplification. Pelosi heard the word leave his mouth, and in that split second, she heard exactly what it sounded like outside the Washington Beltway. She knew it sounded like elite arrogance. She tried to course correct, but in live television, being 1 second late is like being a year late. She said, the policy discussion requires nuance. And nuance, Trump nodded, taking the word from her again. A man loses his job in a pandemic. He stands in a food bank line for 4 hours. He gets a $1,000 bonus from his company, and he uses it to fix his furnace so his kids aren't cold in January. And you, from a home in Pacific Heights with a net worth of $269 million, you look into a camera and you call his furnace money crumbs. He paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. And when someone points that out, you say he's oversimplifying. You say he needs more nuance. The anchor tried to speak, but Trump didn't talk over him. He talked right through him the way water forces its way through a crack in a dam. Here is what I want to know, Nancy. When is the last time you had to choose between fixing the furnace and paying the electric bill? Because the man who got those crumbs, he makes that choice every single winter. He does not need nuance. He needs heat. Listen to me, as a broadcaster and a politician, this was the absolute turning point of the night. The audience at home understood it long before the studio audience caught up. Trump wasn't arguing macroeconomic policy. He wasn't debating tax brackets. He was translating her. He was taking the sterile, insulated vocabulary of the Capitol's marble hallways, words like oversimplification, nuance, and disproportionate, and he was holding them up right next to a freezing living room and a broken furnace in the dead of winter. The vast, echoing distance between her vocabulary and that broken furnace became the entire story of the debate. He never once had to say she was out of touch. Her own words, weaponized by his framing, said it for her. But Pelosi is a fighter. She regrouped. You do not survive 37 years in the most cutthroat building in Washington unless you know how to turn a disastrous minute into a victorious hour. She went on the offensive because attacking is the territory where she holds a permanent passport. You want to talk about the pandemic? She challenged, her voice finally finding solid ground. Your administration's response cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Ventilator shortages, testing failures. While you were holding rallies, people were dying in hospital parking lots. Do not lecture me about April 2020, Trump said. And he said it so quietly that Pelosi actually talked right over him for half a sentence before she even realized he had completely altered the direction of the river. I remember passing the CARES Act, she pressed on. The largest relief package in history. In April 2020, Trump continued, ignoring her legislative resume. You went on a late-night comedy show, James Corden. You opened your freezer on national television. A $24,000 freezer full of ice cream, $13 a pint. And you said, here, Trump's voice shifted. It did something strange and almost tender. He did a half impression of her that was infinitely more devastating than any loud mockery could have been, simply because it was completely accurate. He mimicked her tone. I don't know what I would have done if ice cream were not invented. That was a lighthearted moment on a late-night show. Pelosi fired back, instantly defensive. Lighthearted, Trump repeated, letting the words sit there under the studio lights. You know what was happening the exact same week you were being lighthearted? A food bank in San Antonio. There was a line of cars 4 miles long. 4 miles. People sitting in their vehicles for 4 agonizing hours just to get a cardboard box of basic groceries, and you were on national television showing off your designer ice cream. My friends, if you have ever stood in a line you did not want to stand in, waiting for something basic that you should never have had to wait for, while someone who has never stood in a line in their entire life goes on television to tell you what you should be grateful for, then you know exactly what 30 million Americans felt when they heard him say that. But the ice cream wasn't even the worst part. Pelosi desperately tried to pivot. I passed the CARES Act, which put money directly into, let's talk about September Trump cut in. September 2020. Every single salon in the state of California was closed by government mandate. Your party closed them. Hairdressers couldn't work. They couldn't pay their rent. Customers couldn't get a haircut for months. And you walked into a salon in San Francisco maskless and got a blowout. Pelosi responded instantly, the practice defense mechanism kicking in. That has been thoroughly addressed. I was set up by the salon. I was set up by a security camera that had been in the salon since the day it opened. Trump did not smile. The cameras were not installed for you, Nancy. They were already there. You just didn't think they were watching. There it was. That was the reflex the American people instantly recognized. It wasn't just the hypocrisy. The public is used to political hypocrisy. What they recognized with crystal clarity was the pivot. The immediate shift from I made a mistake to I am the victim, the I was set up defense. They have seen that move of King, and every single time from 1,000 different politicians, and every single time it translates to the exact same thing. I got caught, and I am so important that I do not believe I should have to answer for it. Do you know what happened to the salon owner? Trump asked, his voice dropping another half register. The showman was gone. The performance had pulled back like a tide rushing out to sea, and what was left underneath was absolute unvarnished reality. Her name was Erica Kious. She followed your rules. She closed her business. She did exactly what your government ordered her to do. And when she released the video of you breaking the very rules you helped champion, she lost everything. She got death threats. Her business was destroyed by 1-star reviews. She had to shut down permanently. He paused, letting the tragedy of an ordinary citizen hang in the air. She followed your rules and she lost her shop. You broke your rules, you got a blowout, and then you went on television and called her a liar. The studio went completely silent. And as a broadcaster, I need you to understand that this was not the polite, attentive quiet of a CNN audience waiting for the next commercial break. It was a profoundly different kind of quiet. It was the crushing silence of a room that has just heard a truth it cannot unhear. In the third row of that studio, the cameras caught a man. He hadn't spoken all evening. He wore a wedding ring, had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and possessed the thick, calloused fingers of a man who works hard with his hands. That man just closed his eyes for a moment. It wasn't an expression of anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of an ordinary citizen who had followed every single rule during the lockdown. A man who wore his mask at the grocery store even when it fogged up his glasses. A man who skipped his own mother's funeral because the government mandate was 10 people and there were 11 in his family. He did all of that because the government told him it was a matter of life and death. And now he was sitting 10 feet away, looking at the woman who demanded his sacrifice, knowing she had walked into a closed salon without a mask for a haircut. He wasn't surprised. He was living in the desolate territory far beyond surprise, the place where a citizen simply accepts that the rules of the ruling class were never meant for the ruling class. That kind of acceptance is heavier than any outrage. And sitting right beside him in that third row was a woman, silver-haired, wearing small earrings. She looked like the kind of lifelong voter who had pulled the lever for the Democrats in 6 straight elections and never intended to stop. That woman just looked down at her hands. The polite civic expression she had maintained all evening completely washed off her face. She didn't drop her gaze because she suddenly agreed with Donald Trump's politics. She dropped her gaze because she had just witnessed a moral indictment that had no valid rebuttal. She knew what that silence meant. Trump added, almost like an afterthought, the way a master fisherman casually casts a line he isn't even ready to reel in yet. But the salon is just the small rule you broke. The big one we haven't even gotten to. Pelosi straightened her posture. She was not finished. You don't hold the gavel by yielding ground. She reached for the heaviest, most destructive weapon in her political arsenal. The one she had been saving for this exact moment. The one that had worked in every single room she had ever deployed it in. You want to talk about accountability, she said, her voice turning to steel. The grandmother with the pearls was gone. The ruthless Speaker of the House had returned. You were impeached twice. You incited an attack on the United States Capitol. You acquitted, Trump interjected, twice acquitted by your own party refusing to acquitted, Trump repeated firmly. You impeached, the jury acquitted. That is how the justice system works, Nancy. You've been in the system for 37 years. You know the rules. He let that reality land, and then, before she could pivot back to her talking points, he struck. But since you brought up that night in the Capitol, since you brought up that specific chamber, let's talk about what you did in that chamber. February 2020, the State of the Union address. Pelosi didn't hesitate. I tore up a manifesto of mistruths, she declared proudly, and I would do it again. You tore up a speech, Trump said, and for the first time all night, his tone completely shifted. He wasn't counterpunching. He put his gloves down. What was left was flat, heavy, and dead serious. Do you know what was actually in the physical speech you tore up? A speech full of misleading. Pelosi started, Charles McGee, Trump said. He said the name with deep reverence, the way you speak, the name of someone you owe an unpayable debt to, 100 years old, one of the very last surviving Tuskegee Airmen. He flew combat missions in World War II so that you could have the right to sit in the chair you sat in. He was sitting right there in the gallery that night. I honored him. The entire chamber stood up and applauded. Both sides of the aisle. Pelosi opened her mouth to speak, but Trump didn't let her. Amy Williams, he continued, his voice was getting quieter, not louder. And as a television host, I can tell you that is exactly how you know a moment is deadly real. Politicians yell when they are acting. They get whisper quiet when they are going for the heart. Amy Williams, a military wife. Her husband was deployed in a combat zone in Afghanistan. She had no idea we were bringing him home. He walked out from behind the gallery railing. She saw him. She hadn't held her husband in 7 months. She grabbed him. She cried, and the entire room cried with her. Both Republicans and Democrats cried. Trump looked dead at Pelosi. Not at the camera, not at the studio audience. He locked eyes with her. And when the speech was over, You stood up right behind me, and you ripped all of that in half." He paused, letting the visual sink in. "You did not rip my speech, Nancy. You ripped Charles McGee. You ripped that family reunion. You ripped a 100-year-old man who flew combat missions so you could have the privilege of sitting in that velvet chair and disagreeing with me." Pelosi tried to fall back on her press release language. That speech was a campaign rally disguised as and you said it was, and I am quoting you here, "the courteous thing to do considering the alternative." Trump stopped completely. Ripping up the tribute to a 100-year-old combat veteran is courteous? I would really like to know what the alternative was. Nobody in the studio took a breath. The anchor, a veteran journalist, didn't dare interrupt. The CNN panelists waiting in the adjacent spin room didn't utter a single syllable. Later, when they replayed the broadcast, not one of those professional analysts could tell you the exact second they stopped taking notes. They only knew that at some point their pens were just hovering over their legal pads, completely frozen. I know what Pelosi wanted to say in that moment. She wanted to scream that she had served her country too. She wanted to argue that being the first and only woman to hold the speaker's gavel was a historic triumph that meant something profound. And it did mean something. Nobody in that studio would deny her history. She had 10 meticulously crafted answers for 10 different accusations, and every single one of them was technically correct, fact-checkable, and perfectly defensible in the op-ed section of any major newspaper in America. But she was not writing a newspaper column. She was trapped in a room. And the technically correct Washington Insider answer to the accusation that you ripped up the story of a 100-year-old war hero is absolutely no answer at all. You cannot fact-check human emotion. And the profound, crushing feeling in that studio was not something her 37 years of political maneuvering had ever taught her how to fix. The anchor, doing his job, desperately tried to steer the ship back to safe waters. Let's move to the topic of congressional stock trading, he said, noting that it has been a bipartisan concern and both parties have called for reform. Great topic, Trump smiled. He nodded at Pelosi. Nancy, you mentioned the CHIPS Act earlier tonight. You said you were incredibly proud of it. Tell me, what does it do? Pelosi, highly cautious now, feeling the ground for hidden landmines, gave the textbook answer. It invested $52 billion in domestic semiconductor manufacturing to reduce our dependence on foreign supply chains. $52 billion into semiconductors, Trump repeated. Which companies benefited the most from that? Several American technology companies benefited, but specifically NVIDIA, Trump said, answering his own question. You know, it was NVIDIA. Everyone watching at home with a smartphone can look it up right now. NVIDIA stock went through the roof immediately after the CHIPS Act passed. He took a breath. Nancy, does your husband own any NVIDIA stock? Pelosi stiffened. My husband makes his own independent investment decisions. I have absolutely no involvement in and no prior knowledge of his trades. No prior knowledge. Trump repeated her phrase, reading it the way a man reads the expiration date on a carton of milk he already smells is rotten. You are the Speaker of the House. You know exactly which bills will reach the floor for a vote before the rest of the country even knows the bill exists. You know exactly which specific industries will receive $52 billion in taxpayer money before the financial markets know. And your husband completely independently, with absolutely no prior knowledge, just happens to buy massive options in the exact industry, in the exact company, at the exact time, right before you vote yes on the exact bill that makes the stock explode? He turned to the camera, speaking directly to the working class voters. If you did that at your job, do you know what happens? The SEC calls, the FBI knocks on your door, you go to federal prison. He turned back to Pelosi. You do it, and you go on CNN and say the accusation is ridiculous. Pelosi tried the defensive pivot. She had undoubtedly rehearsed with her staff for hours. The president himself has disclosed hundreds of millions of dollars in stock transactions while holding the office of the presidency. And if we're going to have an honest conversation about I trade, Trump interrupted, owning it immediately. Absolutely, I do. Here's the difference, Nancy. I don't cast legislative votes on laws that directly manipulate the value of the stocks I buy. You do, Pelosi shot back. There has never been any evidence of insider trading, and the New York Times confirmed that I have never. The National Bureau of Economic Research published a study, Trump recited, cutting through the noise. Congressional leaders outperformed the open market by 47%. Trump let that impossible number hang in the air. 47%, Nancy. Warren Buffett doesn't get 47% returns. Billion-dollar hedge fund managers with supercomputers don't get 47%, but the United States Congress does. And you, remarkably, somehow do even better than the average member of Congress. I fully support banning congressional stock trading, Pelosi stated flatly. I have said publicly on the record that I support it. Trump stopped, and then he laughed. As someone who has watched him for years, I can tell you it was not his usual cruel, mocking laugh. It wasn't the boisterous laugh he uses at his stadium rallies. It was a laugh of genuine, bewildered surprise. It was the sound a man makes when he simply cannot fathom the audacity of the lie he just heard. You support banning it now? After you're not the speaker anymore? After all the trades are done? After the millions of dollars are already sitting safely in your bank account? He shook his head slowly, looking at her with a mix of pity and disbelief. Nancy, you support banning congressional stock trading the way a man who just finished a 5-course steak dinner suddenly supports banning dinner. And then the unthinkable happened. The CNN studio audience laughed. Listen to me very carefully, because this is the psychology of television politics. That laugh was the sound of Pelosi's political world collapsing. Pelosi understood the devastating nature of that sound before the laughter even died down. This was a CNN audience. This was her network, her safe space, her demographic, her people. And when your own room laughs at you, there is no green room you can retreat to and hide in. There is no friendly morning show interview you can book the next day to make the public unhear it. There is no op-ed you can write, no army of fact-checkers you can deploy, no slick spokesperson you can send to the podium. Your own people heard your defense, and they laughed in your face. That sound will haunt a politician further than any negative headline ever could, because a newspaper headline can be corrected, but spontaneous, mocking laughter from your own supporters can never be retracted. Pelosi tried one final time to salvage the trades argument. Her voice was noticeably thinner now, the commanding resonance fading, but the sheer professional structure was still there. She was still a creature of Washington. Congress passed the Stock Act in 2012 to address exactly this concern, she recited. Members are legally required to disclose all trades within 45 days. My husband and I have fully complied with every single disclosure requirement under the law. Every transaction is a matter of public record. 45 days, Trump said, zeroing in on the fatal flaw. You get 45 days to tell the American people what you bought. Do you know what 45 days is in the financial world, Nancy? It is more than enough time for a stock to skyrocket 30% before anyone in the public even knows you own it. That is not transparency. That is a government-sanctioned head start. He turned back to the camera, speaking to the everyday workers again. If your boss at your company gave himself 45 days to report his own corporate expense account, you would call that exactly what it is, theft. But when the United States Congress writes itself the exact same corrupt loophole, they slap a fancy title on it, call it the Stock Act, and put it in a press release celebrating their integrity. Pelosi interjected, the senator from Missouri has introduced new legislation to strengthen, named after you. Trump fired back instantly. The Pelosi Act. The new bill designed to ban congressional stock trading is literally named after you. And it's not named after you because you supported it, Nancy. It's named after you because you are the reason it has to exist. The anchor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was a man who had been a journalist for 22 years. He had moderated 9 of these high-stakes town halls and debates. He knew exactly when a live broadcast had sailed right past the safety of the format he had prepared for, entering a volatile territory where the rundown and the commercial breaks were no longer relevant. He didn't even try to steer the conversation back. In the fourth row of the audience, the cameras caught a congressional staffer, a young woman who had worked tirelessly for a Democratic representative for 11 years. A woman who genuinely still believed in the noble work of government. That staffer pressed her lips together tightly and stared down at the studio floor. She didn't look down because she suddenly thought Donald Trump was right about everything in the world. She looked down because she had been the one filing those exact financial disclosure reports for her boss for years. She had seen the dates on the trades. She had seen the timing of the committee votes. And she had never said a single word about it. The laughter that had just rippled through the room was the sound of everyone else finally seeing the ugly truth she had been forcing herself to pretend not to see. If you have ever worked at a company or an institution and known deep down that something was fundamentally corrupt, but you stayed silent because your paycheck and your career mattered more to you than your principles, then you know the exact sickening weight that young woman felt in her chest. If you have ever watched someone finally stand up and say the one true thing you were too afraid to say in a room where it desperately needed to be said, you understand why she couldn't look up. Looking up meant making a moral decision, and she wasn't ready to decide. Not tonight. But the crushing question was now loose in the room, and it was not going to leave when the television cameras were turned off. Pelosi gathered herself for one final stand. She summoned the remnants of her historic authority. I have passed more landmark legislation than any speaker in modern American history, she declared. I protected the Affordable Care Act. I built the coalitions that 37 years, Trump said. His voice wasn't aggressive anymore. It was very quiet. It was almost sad. And as a political observer, I can tell you that sadness was infinitely worse for her than his anger. She knew how to fight his anger. She had built a brand on fighting his anger, but his sadness, his pity, left her completely defenseless. 37 years of absolute power. Tell me, Nancy, how many human beings are sleeping on the concrete sidewalks in your district tonight? Homelessness is a complex national crisis that requires a comprehensive Pelosi started. In your district, Trump pressed gently. The exact city you have personally represented for 37 years. Your city spends $400 million every single year on homelessness. You spend more every year, and every single year, the misery on the streets gets worse. 37 years, and it only gets worse. He paused, letting the tragic reality of San Francisco settle over the debate table. But your net worth didn't get worse, did it? Your net worth did very, very well. The anchor started to say, we should. Trump ignored him, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You sit here and say you're a public servant. 37 years of public service. You came into Congress and you were not a wealthy woman. Now, you sit on a fortune of $269 million while your district still has desperate people sleeping in the gutters. He looked at her. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't look at the audience. He looked straight into her soul. Who exactly served who, Nancy? The silence that followed that question was profound. It was not the silence of a room anxiously waiting for an answer. It was the heavy, terminal silence of a room that had already received the answer and knew the verdict was final. Then, very softly, with the finality of closing a book you have just finished reading, Trump delivered the final blow. You called their money crumbs, Nancy, from your freezer. Speaker Nancy Pelosi did not respond. I watched her hand. Later, when the political analysts replayed the footage frame by frame, agonizing over every pixel on 3 different news networks, they would all point out that her hand physically moved before her conscious mind did. It was the way a human body instinctively flinches a fraction of a second before the brain actually registers the pain of a burn. She reached blindly for the stack of note pages beside her water glass, and she began to fold once. The crisp, sharp sound of heavy paper bending in a television studio so completely devoid of noise that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Twice. It was the exact same fold, performed by the exact same hands belonging to the exact same woman who had arrogantly folded a different piece of paper on a different monumental night, standing elevated in front of a different set of cameras, right before she ripped a president's State of the Union address into pieces. Pieces that tonight felt like something that could never, ever be put back together. Every single person in that studio saw the physical echo. The anchor saw it. The veteran cameraman operating camera 2 saw it, and he slowly tightened his shot without the director even having to whisper the command in his earpiece. And in living rooms from the Rust Belt of Scranton to the borders of San Antonio, the millions of Americans who vividly remembered the arrogance of that night 4 years ago saw the poetic justice of it now. They were watching the involuntary muscle memory of a politician whose most famous viral act was an act of televised destruction, desperately reaching for a piece of paper in her ultimate moment of public defeat, only to find that the theatrical gesture had followed her all the way to this table, to this night, where it meant something entirely different. It meant surrender. She folded the paper a third time, and then she set it down flat on the table, pressing it with both hands gently, the way a defeated general sets down a sword they will never pick up again. She did not rip the paper, not this time. And she didn't refrain from ripping it because she made a strategic choice not to. She didn't rip it because there was absolutely no power left inside the gesture. The rip had been the ultimate symbol of her authority once. Tonight, it was nothing but a hollow reflex. It was the phantom limb of a speaker who was no longer the speaker, reaching out blindly for a gavel that had been taken away. The anchor cleared his throat, the sound shattering the tension. Speaker Pelosi, would you like to respond? She looked down at the sharply folded page resting on the table. She looked up and said weakly, "I think the American people can see what's happening here." But that was the entire problem. They could see. They could see exactly what was happening, and what they saw was the absolute destruction of the illusion she wanted them to see. The broadcast ended exactly 14 minutes before the 11 o'clock hour. Down in the CNN control room, it was dead quiet. It was quiet in the specific, terrifying way that control rooms get quiet after a live, unscripted event goes somewhere completely off the rails, somewhere no producer ever planned for it to go. The executive producer sat back slowly in his heavy leather chair. A junior video editor sitting right next to him, staring at the monitors, finally broke the silence and asked, "How do we cut that down for the 11 o'clock highlight package?" The veteran producer didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screens for a long moment. Then he said, "We don't cut it. We run the whole thing." He knew the truth of modern media. He knew that cutting a single second of that exchange would look like a cover-up. It would look like CNN deliberately trying to shield one of their own political allies. And so they made the journalistic choice. They would air every single minute, every agonizing silence, every brutal question, every slow fold of that paper. And the unedited, uncut version was going to be infinitely worse for Nancy Pelosi's legacy than any malicious edit ever could have been. Because an edit can always be accused of partisan bias. But the whole unvarnished truth has no bias. It just sits there plain as day, and the people watch it and they decide for themselves. Let me take you out of Washington for a moment, out of the studio, to show you what this actually meant. In Kettering, Ohio, there was a woman named Ruth. She was sitting in her modest living room with her television set still on, but she had muted the volume now. The pale blue light of the screen was washing over the empty room she had shared with her beloved husband for 41 years before he passed away the previous spring. Ruth was 68 years old. She had worked her entire life as a dedicated bookkeeper for a small, struggling manufacturing company, putting in 23 years of hard labor. And back in 2018, she had been one of the millions who received a $1,000 bonus right after those controversial tax cuts. She hadn't spent that money on stock options. She hadn't spent it on a designer freezer. She had used that $1,000 to pay for her husband's life-saving blood pressure medication for 3 crucial months because their insurance policy simply did not cover the full cost. She had looked at the math, and the difference came down to either buying the medication to keep him alive or fixing the broken water heater in their basement. She chose the medication. The water heater had to wait until March. Ruth heard the word crumbs spoken on her television tonight. She didn't cry. She didn't throw anything at the screen. She didn't shout in anger. She just sat perfectly still in the cold blue light with her worn hands folded in her lap. Because tonight she finally knew. She didn't just suspect it. She didn't just feel it in her gut. She knew it as an absolute fact. The powerful woman who had dismissed that life-saving money as crumbs had never, not once in her entire privileged life, sat at a scratched kitchen table with a cheap calculator and a towering pile of past due bills, forced to choose which ones to pay this month to survive and which ones to shove back into the drawer, not once. And you could hear that profound, heartbreaking disconnect inside the very word itself. You could hear the astronomical distance in it. Crumbs. It is the vocabulary of a person who has never actually been close enough to the breadline to know what crumbs really look like to a starving person. Ruth didn't turn the television off. She just sat there in the quiet of her empty house. And after a long while, she reached over to the side table, picked up her phone, and called her grown daughter. When her daughter picked up the line, Ruth just asked, "Did you watch it?" And her daughter said, "Yeah." Neither of them said another word for about 10 seconds. And in the context of a late-night phone call between a mother and a daughter, 10 seconds is an eternity. Finally, her daughter broke the silence and softly said, "I'm glad Dad didn't hear that word." And Ruth, staring at the muted screen, said he did. He heard it back in 2018. He just didn't say anything. Back in Washington, outside the CNN bureau, Donald Trump walked out the side entrance. There was no chaotic press line waiting for him. There was no triumphant victory lap for the cameras. As he walked down the corridor, there was only a CNN technical engineer standing by the doors. A young guy in a polo shirt with the corporate logo on the chest, wearing a heavy headset resting around his neck. That engineer knew he shouldn't say anything. He worked for the network, and the network had strict protocols regarding neutrality, rules that existed for very good reasons that he generally respected. But as Trump walked past him, that young engineer just nodded. It was a very slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was the kind of subtle acknowledgement a working class guy gives when he desperately doesn't want management to see it, but he needs to convey the message. It's the kind of nod that means absolutely nothing to a passing stranger and absolutely everything to the person who knows what just happened. Trump saw it. He nodded back. He didn't stop walking. He didn't say a single word. He just walked out to his waiting car in the cool, crisp Washington night, walking right past the towering satellite trucks, the tangled power cables, and the dark, imposing windows of the media building. Somewhere upstairs in that building, a profoundly defeated woman was quietly gathering her notes from a debate table. She was folding those papers one final time, tucking them away into an expensive bag she would carry down to a chauffeured car, which would drive her back to a sprawling mansion worth more money than the combined value of most of the homes in most of the struggling towns that had just watched her systematically dismantled on live television. Trump didn't even bother to look back at the building as his car pulled away. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he had done. He had left what he came to leave resting permanently on that debate table under the glaring hot lights, broadcasting on her home network inside her own friendly room. And he knew his words would still be there in the morning and the morning after that and the morning after that, long after the CNN studio went completely dark, long after the heavy broadcast cameras were packed away into their cases, long after the audience chairs were stacked against the walls. His legacy would remain. He left it in the one and only place in modern media where it could never, ever be edited out. He left it hanging forever in the crushing silence after a question she could not answer.